Is this okay? Okay. Well, thanks for coming on at 10 a.m. In the morning. I appreciate you all making the effort. As I was preparing for this talk, I can't say it was enjoyable. I had to revisit this period of the Labour anti-Semitism controversy, which raged for 4 years, and it wasn't a fun time to be in and around the Labour Party, also in and around the kind of Jewish left at the time. It's hard to kind of remember now, maybe, but it was in its protractedness and in its profile and in its virulence. The campaign to accuse Labour of anti-Semitism under Corbyn, it was really unprecedented in modern British history. I mean, one study counted 5,500 national newspaper examples in that period, solely devoted to anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And the tone was just, like, the register in which these allegations were made was hysterical. I just brought a couple of quotes because even I forgot exactly the kinds of things that were being said. So in the national press, Labour was stigmatised as, quote, the party of bigots and thugs where Jew haters are cheered, a racist party, the most anti-Semitic party in generations, a cesspit of anti-Semitism infested with Jew hatred, Corbyn's anti-Semite army. This was all in the national press. Corbyn himself was said to be, excuse my language, a fucking anti-Semite and racist. That was by one of his own party MPs. The most dangerous man in Britain, Britain's most prominent anti-Semite, the most dangerous racist in British politics. One columnist alleged that he wants to reopen Auschwitz, and all three of Britain's Jewish communal newspapers, they published on the same day a joint front-page editorial asserting that Corbyn-led government would pose an existential threat to Jewish life in Britain. And claims like that, they weren't marginal excesses on the fringes of an otherwise kind of sober narrative, they were the narrative. Basically, the claims boiled down to three, or two really. Corbyn himself was an anti-Semite, that was one basic claim. The second claim was anti-Semitism within the Labour Party had become pervasive, widespread, and had surged under and because of the leadership of Corbyn. Those were the two basic claims. I reviewed the evidence in detail at the time, as did others. No persuasive evidence was ever presented in support of them. Corbyn himself, I mean, I don't know if people are aware of his record, but he could probably lay claim to being the most consistent and active opponent of racism among Britain's political class. He was an anti-fascist campaigner for decades. He constantly cited the famous Battle of Cable Street in 1936, when the far right was beaten back by Jewish activists and left anti-fascists, as an example for him, as a model. And funnily enough, like throughout those years, he was surrounded by his closest advisors were left-wing Jews. You know, I mean, I can go further into those, but that was just a libel against the man. And then as for the broader picture, far from being in imminent and overwhelming danger, the picture is that British Jews are, on aggregate, the most prosperous, well-integrated minority group in Britain. According to the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, which is one of the most kind of respected of these research bodies. Levels of anti-Semitism in Britain are among the lowest in the world, and Jews were, quote, seen overwhelmingly positively by an absolute majority of the population. The prevalence of anti-Jewish stereotypes among Labour supporters didn't rise under Corbyn, but fell. That's according to, or remained fairly consistent. That's according to this organisation called the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which is virulently anti-Corbyn. Levels of anti-Semitism were not unusually high among people on the left and among Labour supporters. In fact, according to the Jewish policy research, Britain's political left was on average, quote, a more Jewish-friendly segment of the population. And similarly, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which is a very right-wing anti-left group, it said Labour Party supporters were, quote, less likely to be anti-Semitic than other voters. Indeed, even as it should be noted that a lot of the individual claims of anti-Semitism made during those years against Labour members, they almost all refer to online posts, tweets and Facebook posts and so on. Groups of people spent hours and hours, days and days, weeks and weeks, trawling the internet, trying to find, sometimes going back years, 8 years into the past, trying to find evidence of a dodgy tweet here, dodgy post there, which they then used. Firstly, they sent it to the press to create this impression of a mounting, pervasive anti-Semitism crisis in the party. They also flooded Labour's complaint system with thousands of vexatious, duplicate, trivial complaints, which stalled the whole process completely. Just to give one sense of that, in 1 year, 2019, half of all anti-Semitism complaints were submitted by one guy who just spent all day looking for, you know. So this wasn't like an organic grievance. This was a campaign to try to manufacture a grievance. Even so, the proportion of members that ended up being going through Labour's disciplinary procedures for anti-Semitism, it rounds down to 0. It was 0.24% in the end. And that's just who had a complaint against them, not a valid complaint. Of course, the way it was covered in the media was very different. One survey found that they asked the average member of the public, what proportion of Labour members do you think have had an anti-Semitism complaint directed against them? And the average answer was 34%. So they thought 1/3 of Labour's membership had had an anti-Semitism complaint. Again, the actual figure was less than 1/4 of 1%. The main way in which this impression of kind of pervasive anti-Semitism in the party was created was by taking individual unrepresentative posts by random party members or alleged party members and generalizing from them to an organisation of 500,000 members. That was the main strategy. But there were also like high-profile cases where simple fabrications and fraud were used. So at the time, I investigated one such case. It was at the annual conference of Labour in 2017. They had a conference in Brighton. And I wrote an article saying, is this a Labour anti-Semitism conference or Nuremberg rally? Because the way that it was portrayed in the media, they said it was like quotes like the anti-Semitism in the rancid guts of Labour has become centre stage, and the whiff of bloodlust rises from Brighton. I remember that was one quote. Well, I looked into every single concrete allegation that was made in relation to that conference, every one. 0 held up to scrutiny, none, and almost all of them implicated Jews. Like almost all of the alleged perpetrators were Jewish members of the party or Jewish people who were speaking there. So there was just straight out fabrication in many cases. Now, the next question is, so in other words, in my view, there was no Labour anti-Semitism crisis. There's some anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, but the idea that there was a crisis of anti-Semitism was a fraud. Now, the next question is, well, who generated this idea? Who generated the campaign? Briefly, in my opinion, there were three kind of distinct but overlapping networks. You had pro-Israel groups, pro-Israel Jewish organizations and media publications. You had the Labour right, which at the parliamentary level hated Corbyn, hated the Corbyn leadership. It was kind of a fluke which led to Corbyn being able to kind of parachute over them into the leader's office. And from day one, he was isolated, and he had a lot of support among the membership, which grew massively to become like the largest mass member party in Europe, I believe. But among the parliamentary level, it was completely isolated and despised. So you had pro-Israel groups, you had the Labour right, and then you had the full breadth of Britain's establishment, political and media class that united to defeat this popular insurgency. And I think every element of that coalition was crucial. If it wasn't for the Jewish organizations and the pro-Israel groups, charges of anti-Semitism by the Tories or the Labour right, they wouldn't have had credibility if they hadn't been validated by the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Chronicle, and so forth. So they provided the credibility and the validity to the allegations. On the other hand, if it had only been the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Chronicle and so on making these allegations, no one else would have heard of them. I mean, they've been accusing the left and the Palestine Solidarity Movement of anti-Semitism for years, and usually it rarely makes a stir. It became a national issue in these years because, for their own reasons, the major media outlets, the Labour right and the Tories amplified those allegations to defeat Corbyn and to demobilise his newly mobilised mass base. So that's basically the coalition that I see as having driven this crisis. Actually, recently, just last week on Sunday in The Observer, there was just one snapshot into this coalition. It was revealed. There was an article which recounted that. So there's an organisation called Labour Together. It's run by this guy called Morgan McSweeney, and he is from the Labour right, and he got money from a big pro-Israel donor and also a big kind of Blairite donor to incubate a replacement to Corbyn quite early on. And they ended up being Starmer's leadership campaign, forming the backbone of Starmer's leadership campaign. And what this article revealed is they sent people to systematically trawl Facebook posts to dig up anti-Semitic or purportedly anti-Semitic messages from random Labour Party members and farm them out to journalists to destabilise the leadership. And secondly, this guy Morgan McSweeney, he was very upset that Labour Party members were reading this alternative media outlet called The Canary, which was pro-Corbyn, and he was very upset that among Labour Party supporters and members, as many people were reading The Canary as were reading The Guardian. And this upset him greatly, and he even said something like, either we defeat The Canary or The Canary defeats us. And so what they did, it seems, is set up this group called Stop Funding Fake News, without disclosing their connection to it, of course. And this group Hugh's the Canary, which was edited by a Jewish woman, of anti-Semitism, and pressured advertisers to stop allowing their adverts to be placed on that website, and they basically crippled the site. So that's just the one little snapshot into how these different coalitions, you've got a pro-Israel donor funding a Labour right campaigner who used anti-Semitism to destabilise the leadership and neutralise one particular media outlet that was supporting it. Of course, most of what happened is we don't have, it's behind the scenes, but it's one intriguing glimpse. The next question is, well, there was this anti-Semitism crisis, or this kind of, in my opinion, confected controversy. What was the effect? Like, what role did it play in Corbyn's defeat and the Corbyn movement's defeat in 2019? If you listen to leading figures in the British Jewish community, it had a big effect. Like, they publicly claimed credit for defeating Corbyn. So, for example, Marie van der Zyl, who is she was the head of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. She boasted about how, in 2018, about how we were able to keep this issue dominating the headlines for weeks on end. The head of the campaign against anti-Semitism crowed, "We did it," after the election result, and so on. So they've claimed a great deal of credit. However, I don't think the evidence really supports it. I haven't looked at, I should caveat, I haven't looked at recent studies, if there have been any. I looked at it a couple of years ago, so what I'm reporting to you is what I found then. It was Brexit. The overwhelming reason was Brexit. That's why Labour lost in 2019. The anti-Semitism issue really didn't cut through to the broader population. A Populous survey, Populous is an organisation that monitors the media and the impact of media stories on public opinion. At the peak of the hysteria over Labour anti-Semitism, which was in 2018, Populous found, quote, "This is simply not a big story for most people." And then the following year, in 2019, Populous reviewed the most noticed news stories of that year, and they found that while Brexit utterly dominated public attention throughout the year, anti-Semitism just didn't even mention merit unmentioned in that report. However, so as a direct impact, it was a secondary and tertiary factor in Labour's defeat. That's my reading of the evidence. But I think its indirect impacts were greater and harder to quantify. What were the indirect impacts? Number one, they made Corbyn appear weak. The way that he responded or failed to respond effectively to this issue. It made him appear like a weak leader. And one of the top reasons people cited for why they didn't like Corbyn and didn't see him as prime ministerial material was weakness. Now, Brexit again contributed to that because he was trying to manage this divided coalition on that issue, and so he started vacillating. And his whole appeal had been his moral conviction and so on. So once he started vacillating over some issues, it really undermined his appeal. But nonetheless, his apologetic and sometimes inconsistent stances on the anti-Semitism question and his inability to just take control of the issue contributed to his perception as a weak leader. The second indirect impact, I think, was the demoralising effect it had and the disorientating effect that it had on the base, on the mass membership. I mean, that was an active, enthused, confident membership was his only real base of support. I mean, as I say, he was completely isolated at the parliamentary level of the party, in the media. He had some union support, but the membership was his real source of strength. And I can tell you subjectively, going through that at the time, it was just this mounting feeling of dread every summer, sometimes every spring. There'd be another anti-Semitism controversy for days on end. Prominent left commentators in the media wouldn't defend the membership against some of these sweeping, unevidenced denunciations of them as a bunch of racists. The leadership itself didn't give people a strong line, and sometimes made concessions that were confusing for people because they weren't true. And so it was just really disorientating and demoralizing. I mean, many of these people, it's their first time in politics, and they entered the Labour Party very excited to try and change the country, end poverty and so on, and suddenly they're being depicted as Corbyn's anti-Semite army, and no one really defended them. So that was another indirect indirect impact. It drained activist morale. Finally, I just want to kind of throw out some lessons as an invitation to then discussion. Because I do think the propaganda offensive against Corbyn on this issue has kind of fashioned a template that can be used and has been used against left forces elsewhere. You saw it even with Bernie Sanders when he was looking like before he lost, when he was looking like a real threat. You suddenly saw the proliferation of all these groups: combat anti-Semitism movement, stop anti-Semitism. Like there was like a list of a dozen groups suddenly started being forming, and they were ready to do the Corbyn playbook all over again. It never really happened because Bernie, his campaign ended before. It would have, obviously he has some protection for being Jewish, but it would have gone after the Squad and Bernie for associating with them and so forth. So this is a template, so it's important for every other left movement to think how to respond. Here's the lessons I took from it. Number one, don't try to appease the unappeasable. Don't mistake a pretext for a grievance. Many times, the leadership of the Labour Party was counselled and took the counsel to compromise and say, okay, we don't really agree with this, but let's just expel this person, suspend this person, even though they didn't do anything wrong. Let's adopt the IHRA definition, even though we don't agree with it. Because maybe that will get people off our backs, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work because that was none of those things were ever really the goal. The goal was to get rid of Corbyn and to defeat Corbynism. And every time these concessions were made, it just encouraged the other side to press on, now from a stronger position. So, for example, there was one case, so Corbyn had appeared at an event where a Holocaust survivor called Meyer also appeared, and Meyer used his speech at that event to use his experience as a survivor of the Holocaust to talk about the suffering of the Palestinians. And the fact that Corbyn had appeared alongside him at this event was cited as more evidence of his anti-Semitism. And Corbyn apologised for appearing there. And the thing is, when you do that, I think he later expressed regret that he did apologise for that. But my point is that whenever someone apologises for something like that, it validates the accusation, and it means that everyone else finds it much more difficult to push back against. It establishes a precedent. Because then if anyone else tries to dispute that new standard that's been set, the response is, well, even Corbyn apologised for it. Even he accepted that's problematic or anti-Semitic. So you just validate these false premises. So that would be my first lesson. None of those concessions that Labour made silenced its critics for 1 second, but they did demoralise its members and confuse them. The second point, which is closely related, which is don't collude in falsehood, stick closely to truth. Taking anti-Semitism seriously, which everyone should, it means being honest about it. It doesn't mean deferring to this or that interest group about it. It doesn't mean just saying things or doing things to get some media pressure off your back. If you take something seriously, it means you invest resources to find out what's the reality of the situation, and then you speak that truth, regardless of what the media reaction will be. I remember that as someone who was writing at the time, there was like a premise that you had to accept in order to be allowed into the mainstream conversation about these issues. And if you didn't accept this premise, then you couldn't speak. You're just out in the wilderness. And that premise was, there is a Labour anti-Semitism crisis. And then, if you accept that, there's some debate allowed, like, so what should be done about it, who's to blame, etc., etc. But the evidence was very clear that there wasn't a Labour anti-Semitism crisis. Or, to put it the other way, no strong evidence had been presented to show that there was. But by going along with that, once you accept that basic premise, it becomes much harder to fight all these other demands that then follow. So stick to truth. Stick to truth. That's my second. That was my second lesson from it. A third would be Corbyn never. And these criticisms, I don't mean it as like, Corbyn's a bad guy or something. I mean, he was under a very difficult position. But again, in the spirit of drawing lessons, he never called out what was going on for what it was. He never called out the agendas that were at play. He never pointed out how weird it was that we should be taking lectures on anti-racism for groups that support apartheid elsewhere. He never frankly called out the machinations that were going on behind the scenes. And the problem with that is that it left the membership, who's trying to figure out what's going on, but doesn't have access to the behind the scenes dynamics, confused. And not in a position to gain a real understanding of what's happening. And in my opinion, this is a very common problem with insiders, even principled insiders who want a mass politics. They don't see it as their role to constantly inform the wider movement what's going on. And I think that was a huge mistake. Corbyn should have, for example, with the controversy around the IRA definition, adopting the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. By the way, I don't think it's right to say Corbyn capitulated over that. He tried to not include the problematic bits of that example, but he just didn't have the backing of the National Executive Committee. So he did what he could, but he didn't have the votes within the body that decides these things. But he never explained all of that publicly. That's the thing. Like, all of this was behind closed doors. And so I think that's a huge mistake, and I think any leader in Parliament who wants to try to have a mass politics should always inform their members about what's going on. Another point, don't genuflect before communal representatives. Don't just defer to anyone who claims that they represent this or that community, even if they actually do. It happened to be the case that in Britain, when the Board of Deputies claims to be the voice of British Jewry, it's actually a very dubious claim. They're not as representative as one might think. But even if they were genuinely a democratically representative body for the whole of British jury. It doesn't mean that they're right about these issues. That's the thing. It's like British Hindu groups. They said that Labour's position on Kashmir was a reflection of Hindu phobia. And maybe they believe that, and maybe British Hindus believe that at large, but it's not true. And this principle of the principle of always listening to representatives of minority groups and making extra efforts to hear them and listen to them is a good one, because if you don't make extra efforts, then their voices will be excluded. But to say that one should defer automatically to them rather than applying standards of reason and so on to what they claim, that's too far. And it also often means that minorities of the minorities, so left-wing Jews say, who are a minority within the Jewish community, they get completely trampled on if you just allow self-proclaimed, the establishment Jewish groups to be the sole voice for that community, which is exactly what happened in the Labour case. I can talk about that more if you want. I guess the final thing is to hold true to the best libertarian traditions of the left. Obviously, there are very illiberal traditions on the left as well, but I think the best of the left has always held free speech to be an important value, and left movements have indeed been at the forefront of fights for civil liberties, including freedom of expression throughout the 20th century, and I think that's been forgotten in recent years and recent decades, and certain other principles have become kind of a common sense, like any speech which is offensive or is considered hateful should be censored, that anyone who has uttered such speech should be expelled from an organisation, principles like that, and exactly those ideas were then used by pro-Israel Jewish groups in this controversy to say, well, why can't we define the oppression that we face? If you're saying, well, every minority group should define its own oppression, and then anyone who infringes that should be silenced or driven out, well, why doesn't it apply to Jews then? I mean, why can't Jews define anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism? And then if someone is anti-Zionist, then why don't you silence them? And that really that's one of the reasons why this was so disorientating for people in the Corbyn movement, because they did take these ideas very seriously. Corbyn himself was a subscriber to the idea that you should always censor hate speech, and in general minorities should define their own oppression, and so on and so forth. So it was hard to know what to do when Jewish groups asked for the same principles to be applied to them. So I hope that experience prompts a kind of deep soul searching about whether it was a good idea to abandon or to erode the left's commitment to freedom of expression and to setting a very high threshold before being willing to silence people on the grounds of offence. There are other things to say, but maybe that's enough to prompt a wider discussion, and thanks for listening.